What if the true measure of leadership wasn't control, but kindness? What if the greatest leaders weren't the loudest voices in the room, but the ones who lifted others up, caught them doing things right, and led with love? Today, we're diving into the story of Ken Blanchard, a man who redefined what leadership means for millions across the globe. From the one-minute manager to decades of consulting and teaching, Ken's philosophy has shaped boardrooms, classrooms, and even living rooms, reminding us that nice guys don't just finish first, they change lives. And behind this extraordinary story is author and longtime collaborator, Martha C. Lawrence, whose new book, Catch People Doing Things Right, offers an intimate look at Ken's journey, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the timeless lessons of leading with heart. So stay with us, because in the next conversation, you'll discover how vulnerability, optimism, and service can transform not only how we lead, but how we live. Martha Lawrence, welcome to the Blanchard LeaderChat podcast. How are you doing today?
I am doing awesome today, Chad. How are you?
So good. So glad to have you on here. I mean, we're talking about one of our most favorite subjects in Ken Blanchard. The book is called Catch People Doing Things Right, How Ken Blanchard Changed the Way the World Leads. Martha, why this book? Why now?
Why this book? Why now? Well, Chad, as you know, Ken is one of the foremost leadership authorities of the last century, according to the American Management Association. We know how amazing he is. He has legions of fans around the world. He's lived an incredible life. Here's a guy who was told in college that he couldn't write, and he goes on to co author one of the best selling business books of all time, The One Minute Manager. Here's a guy who, by his own admission, couldn't even balance his own checkbook, and he goes on to co found a global leadership development organization. So, that alone is worth writing a book about someone who could do those things. But what really inspired me to write this book, Chad, is that there are a lot of biographies about business people, people like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. They're inspiring stories. These guys are really innovative and fascinating, but they're not necessarily great role models as human beings. And boy, it just really seemed to me that we could use some stories about people who achieved success not by ruthless ambition, but by genuinely caring about other people and lifting them up. So that was really what inspired me to write this biography.
You've been with him a long, long time, and you've helped him on a lot of books. You've been a part of that, so you now have this view that not everybody has seen throughout the years. When you think about Ken, what's some of the most inspiring qualities that come to mind?
To me, when I think about Ken's most inspiring quality, it's that the person he is behind the scenes, in private, is, if anything, it's even more awesome than the person that everyone sees out there in the world. You know, he's a champion of servant leadership. When you get to know him as a human being, and I know you know this, Chad, when you get to know him as a human being, he is every bit as wonderful as his press, if not more so. And, you know, I recently had a conversation with Marshall Goldsmith about Ken, and I was making that very point that, you know, Ken is just such an inspiring human being and such a nice guy. And he said, "Oh, well, I have a story about that." And he proceeded to tell me a story about something Ken had done for another person, which I won't repeat here. I could, but unless you want me to. So that's what's so amazing is that the person he is in real life is every bit as wonderful as the person he seems to be through his books and speeches.
How do you think, from your perspective, how did working with Ken kind of changed the way you see leadership in people? I mean, I can say this. I've been with Blanchard when I'm recording this. I just celebrated 21 years here, so I am a byproduct of what he was able to create. I didn't even realize this industry existed, and Ken is one of the Mount Rushmore leaders of this industry. But for you, how has working with Ken changed your viewpoint on leadership?
Well, I was actually in the publishing industry back in the early 1980s when the One Minute Manager came out. And I remember being so gobsmacked by that book because it seemed to be teaching a kind of leadership that was really different than what I had been taught, which was, I came from the school of the leader is the boss, the supervisor is above the subordinate, and really had that sort of rigorous top down thinking about leadership. And here was someone who was teaching me to come alongside people and make leadership more of an influence process and more of a side by side affair. And that is what has really impressed me about working with Ken and watching him do that, watching the way he comes along and lifts people up side by side.
For you, what's made Ken's presence so uplifting, even in the everyday moments?
What has made Ken's presence so uplifting? Ken has this extraordinary ability to be really present with you when you are with him. And there, just the attention he pays to you when you are in his presence is itself uplifting. He's so other focused. There's a story in the book about how he was having a meeting with Mac Anderson once. They were going to collaborate on a book project, and Mac was the guy who founded the company Successories. About, they used to produce these inspirational posters about leadership and courage and fortitude and things like that. And what happened was somebody came to the door and knocked on the door, and it was the widow of an employee who had passed away. And rather than send that widow away, Ken turned to Mac and said, Mac, do you have a few minutes here? And he said, sure. And he goes, I'd really like to introduce you to her. Her husband was one of our beloved employees, and he passed away recently. If you've got a little time, I'd like to do a little something special for her. And he pulled out a tape recorder that he used to carry around all the time back in those days. And he took Mac and the widow over to the department where that person worked and interviewed all of his colleagues and said, do you have some good memories of this person that you'd like to share? We'd love to capture your memories and your thoughts about him on tape. And so for 45 minutes, Ken went around to the man's former colleagues and they captured all these wonderful stories. And then he took that tape and he gave it to the widow and said, here, keep that as a memento and just know how much we really loved working with him. And to me, that is just such an example of how being in the presence of Ken and watching the way he really practiced servant leadership, which is about, how can I serve others, not what can they do for me?
I love that. I love the stories. Keep them coming. When you think about the efforts that it took to capture all the stories that are going into this book, was there a story about Ken that you found particularly difficult to capture in writing because of just the emotional weight?
Well, I used to be a novelist, so I'm sort of adept at dealing with feelings in stories. There were many stories that brought me to tears.
Hmm.
And there's a story in the book about Ken's father. Ken's father he retired as a rear admiral in the Navy. He was one of Ken's major influences, taught Ken a lot about leadership, and Ken tells those stories quite a bit. Several of those are in the book. But Ken's dad, like so many in that generation, was a smoker, and in 1979 he was dying of lung cancer. And Ken tells the story about how he I think he was doing a leadership seminar somewhere and or teaching, and he got the call that his dad was really in bad shape. So he flew out, and he and Lori Hawkins, one of the founding associates, spent some time with his dad, Ted, and Ken knew it was very near the end. It was very obvious. And so when he left the hospital room that day, he took out his trusty tape recorder again and he poured out his heart. Talk about catching people doing things right. He poured out his heart to his father about what a wonderful father he'd been, about all the things his father had done right, and what a difference he'd made in his life, and how much he loved him, and how much everybody loved him. And before he left to go back to his hotel that day, he gave it to his dad and he said, "Dad, listen to this a few times. I think it might bring a smile to your face." And then he went back to the hotel room, and in the middle of the night, he got a call, and it was the nurse telling him that his dad had passed away. And he said, I gave my dad a tape recorder. Did he listen to the tape? And she said, over and over and over again. And that tape, the transcript of that tape is so powerful. I convinced the publisher to keep it in the appendix of the book. So if readers want to read that, it's there in the book. And it's really touching.
That's beautiful. So I touched on this earlier, Martha. You've been with Ken for a while, and so this question is kind of twofold, How do you feel like Ken has brought out the best in you? And then also from your spot on the sidelines, have you seen him bring out the best in those around him?
Ah, how has Ken brought out the best in me? You asked me earlier, Chad, why this book, why now? And I tell you, I have had a ringside seat to a person that I think is one of the most magnificent leaders in the past many, many decades. So, how could I not write a book about this? But another thing is the person I am today versus the person I was when I started working for Ken Blanchard. I'm a much, much better person for having worked with Ken. I have learned so much. Ken used to joke. He said, "You tend to be very task focused," and I am. I'm very task focused. And Ken has taught me that it's really okay to be people focused too. It's important to get work done, but it's also important to stop and acknowledge the people who are helping you do all those things. I can't imagine where my life would be without Ken Blanchard. I am just so grateful that I had this privilege. I feel like one of the luckiest people in the world.
One of the things in my time that I've got to spend with Ken is, and I've shared this to people that ask the question. I'm sure you get asked this question as well, Martha. It's, what's he really like? And I always say it's amazing. In my 20 years here, I've seen him get ready to walk out in front of an arena with 10,000 people. I've seen him get ready to talk to a small group in a boardroom. I've seen him at a company meeting where things are a bit stressful. I've seen him at a private dinner, and the same guy shows up everywhere. And it's Ken. And that's one of the things that I've tried to do better in my life, which is just not to just be myself as much as possible. And because I just see the value that you're going to get with Ken. What's one of the things that you've taken away from Ken that you use in your life, you think more often than
I
others?
love that, Chad. That is so true. He is so authentic. It's truly a gift. He just has this. He is so he is so consistent in who he is. Yeah, the authenticity. I aspire to have that kind of authenticity in my life, and the trustworthiness that comes with that. What you see is what you get. What was the question again? I'm sorry, I was just blown away by that comment you made because it's so spot on.
I love that. Just a lesson that you've taken from Ken that has had definitely left not only a mark on you, but has made the way you look at the world and try to show to the world differently because
Oh,
of Ken.
yeah, so many lessons. I began each chapter with a Ken Blanchard quote, and you can just go through the quotes of Ken Blanchard. In fact, if you Google Ken Blanchard quotes, a lot of wisdom is out there on the internet that he has his bite-sized wisdom. But what I've learned from him is keep your I love yous up to date. You know, that it's hard when you're talking about Ken because you're also talking about his brilliant wife, Margie. And it's hard to know which one of these are Ken Blanchard and which are Margie Blanchard, but keep your I love yous up to date. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. None of us is as smart as all of us. I mean, there's just so much wisdom I've learned from Ken.
Can you share a time? Because it's not always been the most amazing high flying times and especially all the times. How long have you worked with Ken? I keep talking about my 21 years at Blanchard, which I'm pretty proud of. How long have you worked side by side with him?
I think I got you by a year, Chad. I've
Yeah.
worked with him since 2003, so
Well,
22 years.
but you've
Yeah.
been right there beside him, right there at his desk, and working with him. Can you share a time personally where his encouragement gave you a boost when you needed it the most? Because I think more than anything, that is what people tell me about their connections with Ken, where he showed up when they needed him most. And I just love that.
I do love that. And, you know, it really ends up being a personal thing. You know, he's the champion of the one on one meeting. If you're leading people to meet with them one on one, how important that is. And what blew me away about those one on one meetings is they're not always all about business. A lot of them are about what's going on in your life. And in my life, I think you know this story, Chad. I had some real tragedies going on in my life. You know, my sister almost dying, my son disappearing. He was missing and homeless for several years. And
Mhm.
Ken's encouragement and support through those times was just so amazing. To have that kind of, you expect that kind of support from friends and family, but when you have that from the person you're working with, it's so powerful.
You had access not only to the work you did with him side by side, but you had access. You mentioned the tape recorder with his father, but you had access to personal letters, journals, private papers. What insights did you get from that? Even peeling the onion even further and really getting what surprised you there?
Wow, there's so many things. I mean, that's just a treasure trove. I have this giant, huge box in my closet of all these precious, original documents. I think going back into his childhood, I mean, I talk to people, Chad, who have known him since the fifth grade, and going back and finding out how early Ken was interested in leadership. I mean, he had a passion for leading others since grade school. He famously tells the story about winning the president of his seventh grade class and coming home and being all proud, and his father saying, "That's great, Ken, that you won the presidency of the seventh grade, but now that you have that title, don't ever use it. People follow leaders not because they have a title, but because they trust and respect them." So we know those stories, but to go back and see that, for example, he went to school in the 1950s, and schools were still segregated when he was in grade school. And of course, Ken was a basketball player, so he actually made a lot of black friends playing on city leagues. And by the time he got to high school and schools were desegregated, he was really well integrated. He was a very inclusive, as he is today, very inclusive person. And one of his really good friends who happened to be black, Bobby Bradshaw, he and Ken said, what are we going to do about this school? Everything's still so siloed. How can we get people together? How can we bring the students together? And they started something called the Youth Fellowship. And it was so incredible to go back into these documents and find this newspaper clipping from 1956 showing a picture of Ken and Bobby Bradshaw and talking about their youth fellowship. I mean, that was in high school he was doing this kind of stuff, and that was really cool. Reading his dissertation, he was already thinking about how how leaders affect followers back when he was in grad school.
You didn't just start writing when you started working with Ken, so you've worked with hundreds of authors. What's different about working with Ken?
What's different about working with Ken is that Ken as you know, doesn't have a huge ego. And authors, myself included, we tend to be a little bit self-important sometimes and, maybe a little more ego focused, like this is my work and my book. And Ken just doesn't have any of that. He has published 70 books, and the great majority of those are with co-authors. And his mother used to ask him, Ken, why don't you write more books by yourself? Why don't you want to see your name on the cover and not just your name with someone else? And he said, Mom, learning is one of my primary values. When I write with somebody else, I get to learn so much and I get to have so much fun. I already know what I know. I want to work with someone else and find out new things. And, so that's very different.
I love that you describe Ken as a non-threatening nonconformist. Why, why is that so powerful to you?
Well, non-threatening nonconformist, that kind of comes from talking to a lot of his buddies, particularly in college. I talked to his friends, Phil Hodges, who he met in college, and some of those old guys, and they said, Ken always had a little bit of a rebellious streak in him. He ran for president of his college classes as well, and they'd get him all dressed and get him all ready to appear in front of the student body, and he'd look really good, except he'd wear a pair of bright red socks or something. And this continued when he was teaching graduate school, when he got his PhD and he was a professor at UMass. He knew what the rules were, but if he thought those rules were stupid and weren't serving people, he didn't have any problem bending those rules. And the classic story there is that he used to pass out the final exam on the first day of class. And when the faculty found out about that, they said, Blanchard, what are you doing? And he said, I'm trying to teach these kids. I thought I was supposed to teach them the material. And they said, you are, but you can't pass out the final exam on the first day of class. And he said, not only am I going to pass out the final exam on the first day of class, what do you think I'm going to do all semester? I'm going to teach them the answers, because life is about getting A's, not some stupid normal distribution curve. He just hated that idea of failing some students and giving some C's and D's and only a few got A's. He thought that was a dumb rule.
We
Non-threatening, nonconformist.
love that. We've got time for just a couple more questions, and so this just really want to dig more into your personal connection with Ken. So after spending so much time, especially over the last few years, as you're really capturing Ken's life, if you had to share in one story or one lesson what you think Ken Blanchard means to the world, what would you share?
That's a deep one. That's a deep one. What does Ken Blanchard mean to the world? I think ultimately what Ken Blanchard and his life mean to the world is he is a living example that nice guys really can finish first, that you don't have to push and shove to get ahead, that by lifting other people up and serving others, you really can make a name for yourself and have a legacy and yet still be a wonderful person. That's really what he gave to the world. And he also gave to the world this concept of catching people doing things right. We are programmed as human beings to look for what's going wrong in our environment and to jump on that. It's called negative conditioning. It's a negative bias we have, and that's how we survive, because if you looked out and saw what was going wrong in the environment and jumped on it before it killed you, your chances of survival were greater. But we need to override that conditioning. And so Ken's concept of catching people doing things right is really quite deep because it goes against our natural grain.
I remember, I think the very, I'd met Ken at, company events, him welcome you aboard. And again, people always asked about his involvement in the business. And I said, Ken would laugh. Ken was not involved in the business. Ken was our chief spiritual officer. He was there for that reason. He was not about the numbers and the things like that, but he was the backbone and is the backbone of what Blanchard is today. But the first time I truly met with him, I would tell a quick story if I may, Martha. Um, his advanced team back in the day. I couldn't even tell you the date, but it was early on in my career where the advanced team was, hey, Ken's going to be in Chicago. He's doing a keynote here. Do you want to get him at the airport and get him to the event? You can spend some time. And I remember I did that. And on that ride there, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I met Ken Blanchard in that car. You know exactly what I mean by that. We talked about relationships, we talked about work, we talked about faith, we talked about anything and everything. He just came off as just the most down to earth person. And I love that about him. And I just share that to say, I wish, uh, we were doing more podcasts together because he used to finish off all of these podcasts. And we got to talk to Brene Brown and Simon Sinek and Dan Pink. We got to talk to so many different people. They didn't want to have the conversation with me, but they did it because they knew Ken was involved. And that's one of my favorite things. So I want to ask you this question. If Ken was joining us in this conversation today, I'm going to ask you to speak for him because you've written for him. What do you think he would want us all to remember most about how to live, how to love, how to lead?
I think he'd want us to remember that it's not about you, it's about the people you're serving. Life is a very special occasion, and it's an opportunity to serve others. That's what I think he'd want us to remember.
I love that. If there's one thing that you want the people that are going to pick up this book to get out of what you put together, get out of this wonderful book, what do you want that message to be?
What I want people to get out of this book is, first of all, I want them to be inspired because, if you're starting a business, or let's say you want to write a book, or let's say you want to be a speaker, or let's say you want to be a better leader, reading the story of Ken's life is really going to inspire you because he didn't have absolute magic. He is a human being like all the rest of us. And over again, he just practiced what his mother taught him, which was, if life knocks you down, don't stare at your shoes and mumble. Keep your head up and look for opportunities. So what I want people to get out of it is that you too can succeed by being a nice person. And it's a very inspiring story, I believe, in that regard.
Martha, we're super excited about this book coming out. It's published on October 21st. What do people need to know so they can get their hands on this awesome book?
What people need to know is that the book is available for pre-order now. So get your copy wherever you like to buy books, obviously, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can also go, if you're interested, to my website, marthalawrence.com. There's a lot of information about the book there. And yeah, go ahead and pre-order.
Wonderful. Martha, thank you for your time. Thank you for the great stories. Loved hearing everything from your perspective. And I've had a chance, obviously, to read the book. And trust me, listeners, you won't regret it. Go out and get it. So thanks for being a part of the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Chad.
And thank you for joining us for today's podcast. If you enjoyed the interview, go ahead and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please share it with your friends. The best way you can help us grow is feedback. So write a review if you haven't already. This podcast is brought to you by Blanchard, the heart of human achievement. Visit Blanchard.com for additional resources to help you and your organization succeed.